Alright guys, so we're going to get into the render settings a little bit and some of the stuff that I added to the scene here. And then we'll show you quickly what I did as far as in Davinci Resolve, compositing everything together. Now what I did do to the scene is I did add a little bit of extra stuff here. I do have this garbage like asset pack that I bought. I'll put the link down in the description. Unfortunately, I can't give you guys those files because it's a paid file and I don't want to get in trouble. And what I ended up doing was I brought in a few pieces from there. So I brought in a black garbage bag, a couple of garbage bags, and then I even brought in a crate, as you can see down here. I brought in some trash, just some random trash assets that I threw in, and a couple plastic bottles. I put all of those inside of a collection. And then you can see here, if we go into my foreground, I scroll that down here. Here we have trash 1 and 2. Trash 1, basically, I had the big trash, the big plastic bags, and then I had the smaller trash. And the way I got those floating in the sim here was I ended up making a particle system here. So let me quickly show you, just to show you the setup from the particle system here. I got this box here. Let me go ahead and hide this. We don't need to see that, and we don't need to see that. Hide that. So just working with the trash here. So I have a plane, right? And all I did on this plane was add in a particle system. And here is the particle system. My settings, I had it set to 20, very low, because this is for all the small trash assets that were floating around. I had those set to 20, basically, and frame start was -10 because I wanted it to start a little bit before, but I don't actually think that worked, but whatever. I ended up start cutting the sim halfway down, like 40 seconds or 50 seconds in. And then what I did was I basically birthed them on frame 1. So you see here, we'll actually start, if you were to do it, I would just frame them on, start on frame 1, end on frame 1. So they were there, they were born. I set the lifetime to the end of the timeline. And then I went to volume, and then I used all of these settings here. And then from there, I added rotation in, added dynamics in, and then I set render as a collection, and I rendered out that small collection, trash, pick random here for me. I just chose pick random because it kept repeating some of the same ones over, and I just kept tapping that and it would like change it up. So I used that as the render items, and from there, that was pretty much it for the particle system. And then I did the exact same thing on the other particle system, the bigger bags, these three 1, 2, 3, 4 trash bags here. This one you can barely see it on camera. So what was most important about the trash was I set my scene gravity, I turned it off. And then I added in some force fields, and now I had to work a little bit hard to figure out how to get the forces to get it to where it wasn't too erratic, right? So I'm going to show you these force settings that I ended up using, because these are very useful. I'm going to use again for wanting to get that floating like trash or something to be floating around in the scene. So what I did was I added 2 turbulences. I have one turbulence here, and then I have another turbulence right here, so they're kind of staggered up, right? Number 1, you can go down and I can look at my turbulence here, and I would write these settings down, guys, so you can save them, because I already wrote them down again so I can reuse these, because I do a lot of floaty like stuff. So I got it set to turbulence, shape is at point, strength was at 0.5, size was set to 0, flow was to 1, location, rotation, and that was pretty much everything else. And then the seed, again, depending on how big your scene is or how big your items are, it's going to be slightly different for you, but this is just what I ended up doing. I tried to work to scale, meaning like to have things in a real world scale. That's why I set the scale earlier in the track to, I knew I marked off the manhole cover, which was like 1.5 foot. So I used that to get me something of more real life scale. And then on the second one, I think it was exact same settings. Yeah, it was exact same settings. So I just basically took those, staggered them, and that's how I got that nice floaty like floating from the sim here. Let me go ahead and play it for you guys. See, they're just kind of just sitting there nice and floaty. So it took a while to get those settings dialed in. I had to play with the force, mainly the strength, and the flow. The flow says converts effects forces into airflow velocity. I really don't know what that means, but I just play with those two. I play with those. I'll crank up the strength, and then I didn't like it. It was way too erratic. Then I added a little bit of flow, and then kind of slowed it down. So play with those two. And that's how I got those particles and all that stuff going. So now what I'm going to do is show you the render, how I set up my render. I went into compositing. This top here, we don't need to worry about that. That was just the video background, which I didn't render out because I already had the video inside of Davinci Resolve ready. What I did was I got my foreground, I got my background here and my foreground here. Again, my background were going to be all my shadow layers, and I can quickly show you that here. If we go to back to my layout here, and then let me go ahead and zoom into the camera. So right here, this tab up here in the top right, it says foreground and it says background. Those are two different layers within our scene, right? This is my scene I'm in, and these are my two layers. So the background layer, everything, Blender sets this up automatically when we do setup scene, or what is it? Let me see with the button that we press. Setup tracking scene. When you do this, this is what Blender builds out here. This whole footage, distortion node, scale, and then merges it together with a background node and the foreground node, and that's what you see here. What I basically did was I use that setup. I like it because it's very convenient for me. So I go ahead and do a file export. If you don't know how to do that, you press Shift A and then I press S, and then I just basically file, you go FI, right there, file output, you go ahead and select that, and then you're gonna get an output node. And what I typically do is click on that output node, make sure this little sidebar is open by tapping in on your keyboard, and here's my settings. Again, it's already set up because I set up my template file. Open EXRs, RGBA, remember with the alpha, float, and then the Kodak DWAA lossless. And I already have it all ready to go, and then I just click here to save it to my folder. And what I do is I save, okay, so I take my render layer from the foreground and I plug it into its own distortion node here so I can re-distort my CG. Again, my distortion node is set to distort because up here at the top we undistorted it right here. So I re-distorted it here because it's just the CG. And then I exported it out in its own folder. And I threw the hashtag on again at the end, hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. I do that so it can put the numbers there so I can see the numbers correlating to each frame. And then I did the same thing, repeat the same process for the foreground and background. So here's my background and here's my foreground. I'll go export those out. And let me go back quickly to show you what the difference, why we do these layer renders. So here on the background layer, if I go ahead and just turn on the render quickly here, you're not going to see nothing. All you're really going to see is just shadows because this is what's on the background layer. You can see I got shadows here on the side. That's just shadows. We're not seeing anything. And the way it sets it up is if you go to background, if you click this little tab here and you want to turn on this indirect only, and let's turn on holdout. Okay, and let's go back to our thing here. And you can see here on the foreground layer, that is actually checked. The foreground layer, because since we're on this background layer, see here at the top, background, all I want to see from the foreground is shadows, okay? All the indirect light, shadows, reflections, things that are basically not what you're seeing, all the indirect light. So that's all being rendered here on this second background layer. We switch this tab up here to go to the foreground. Now I'm on the foreground. Now we're going to see everything. We're going to see everything but the shadow and indirect light reflections and stuff like that. We won't see all that because see here the background, the ground plane is part of the background. So that's why now there is no shadow on this layer here. So if I go back over to my background layer and click on that, and then if you look here slightly on the bottom, there's the shadows are slowly coming in, and there's the shadows, okay? So that separates it. Some people like to render the shadow in the foreground all together, but they don't do that in Hollywood. I want complete control of everything. I want to control my shadows. Maybe my shadows weren't dark enough. Well, by rendering them out separate, I have control to maybe pump them up a little bit. I have more control just to do a lot of things. Blur them. I have control, right? And I want control of my shadows because the shadows really sell the CG to make it look like it's integrated into the scene. So that's why I do that. And Blender sets it all up for me already, so I don't really have to do all the work. So here's our foreground layer. I render this out here. This will be my foreground render. It's going to render what you see here, all of this stuff, minus the background, because the background is actually technically turned off in the render. So let me show you let me turn the background off. So let me just go to camera down here, turn off the background. Boop. So this is basically what I'm rendering right here. This is what's rendering off the foreground, just this. And then what I'm rendering on the background, you're not gonna really see it too well because of the PNG background, because of the transparency. But I can see it slightly here, and I don't know if it's gonna pick up in YouTube. On the bottom here, there's the shadow. That's what I'm rendering out separately. Okay, so boom. Once I render all this stuff out, go ahead and close this.